Hello, YouTube folk. You've jumped in, and we are just starting now with the informative speech handout. So, let's go ahead and let's get started. Now, I've talked about the four general purposes of public speaking. We speak to introduce ourselves. We speak to persuade other people to do something. We speak to entertain. And, as you might be familiar, that's kind of all I do for my job, we speak to inform. We speak to teach the audience about a subject. Now, that seems a little bit obvious. The informative speech is to inform. So, at its most basic, what this speech is about learning about a subject that you weren't already familiar with, becoming so familiar with it that you are now not necessarily an expert, but that you can teach someone else on the field, and then teaching the audience in a way that's effective, that they're actually learning something they didn't know before, engaging, they want to keep learning and not just fall asleep, and memorable, that not only do they hear and listen to your entire speech, but they're actually able to recall the information in that speech days or weeks or months or years after the fact, because you want the audience to actually remember what was said. Otherwise, there was no point to you giving that speech. I'm giving you a lecture right now on the informative speech. If you don't actually remember what's required, what's up? Please move the window away from the shared. What was that, Rodrigo? Sorry?
I just have a question. Like when we pick our subjects for this assignment, do we have the freedom to decide on anything pretty much?
I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what specific type of I'm going to talk about what specific type of topic you need to pick for this speech, okay?
Okay.
So,
sorry, Professor.
No worries, Rodrigo. Again, I encourage questions. So, for this speech, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be learning, you're going to select a culture that's not your own, a culture that you are not a part of. You are then going to educate yourself on this culture. You're going to do research on it. And then you're going to give a speech where you teach the audience about this culture. Now, culture is actually an incredibly broad term. It can mean anything so long as it's a group of people who are united by something in common. A culture can be tied to a country, Italian culture, for example. A culture can be tied to an interest, surfing culture. A culture can even be tied to just a community. So San Diego, the city in itself, has a common culture. Cultures can be big, they can be small, they can be vague, they can be specific. The important thing to keep in mind is that this culture is comprised of people. And then what you're going to be doing is you're going to be learning about these people, how they live, how they talk with one another, what they do in their free time, all those distinct aspects that make a culture. And then you're going to be teaching the audience all about the different cultures that make up our world. Okay? So, does that answer your question, Rodrigo?
Yeah, kind of. Let's say, okay, so Professor, like, I don't want to be annoying, but like, let's say I've been skateboarding since I was 9 years old, okay? And I've been surfing. So let's say I want to talk about the history of skateboarding and what it means to be from Southern California and grow up on that culture, right? Would that be a topic that you'd be acceptable?
Well, I don't think it would be acceptable because it's a culture you're already a part of. And let me explain. And let me explain why I don't necessarily want you to pick that. Because if I don't make that a requirement of this speech, then what this speech becomes is just the speech of introduction 2.0, where everyone talks with something they're already familiar with, which is their own cultures. Now, the problem with that is that this is a research-based assignment. The point is to have you pick a topic you're not already familiar with, so that you then have to seek out sources of knowledge that are not your own. It helps teach you how to do research for a big speech. So you want to pick a topic, or a culture in this case, that you're not a part of, that you're not familiar with, because now it forces you to have to consult outside sources of knowledge. Now, onto your second point, I would like the idea of someone talking about the history of skateboarding in, say, Southern California. but that wouldn't be the entire subject of the speech. The subject of the speech is skateboarding culture in Southern California. History can be a part of that. You can talk about the history as like one main point of that speech, but you still want to talk about the living, breathing culture of that of skateboarding as it is practiced right now. How skateboarders talk with one another just on the street, some skateboarding gatherings or conventions, some skateboarding customs or norms, all of those distinct aspects that come together to make a culture, not just the history of it, okay?
Also the business and everything. Okay, so let's say I can go ahead and just pick a country and read about that country and just become familiar with whatever they do, and then I can have a speech on that.
You're asking some great questions because it's addressing all the things you want to watch out for when picking a culture. Because again, the other common reflex people are going to have is that they're just going to pick they're going to pick a country. Now, the problem with that is that the bigger the culture you pick, the more vague you have to be about it. And if you're vague about a culture, then you can't really inform the audience. Because think about it. This speech is going to be 3 to 5 minutes long. You can't cover the entirety of a country's culture in that time. So you'd have to be incredibly vague to the point where the audience isn't actually learning anything about these specific people. It's just learning about broad stereotypes and trends. So if I gave a speech on, say, Italian culture, and I'm using this example because every semester I hear about 5 speeches on Italian culture. About 5 different people come up and go, today I'd like to teach you about Italian culture. I'd like to teach you that they have the Colosseum, and they eat spaghetti, and they speak Italian, and their capital is Rome. They teach me these things, these broad categories of Italy, but I still don't know how Italians actually live. And not only that, there is no one broad singular Italian culture. Northern Italy has a very different culture than Southern Italy. Sicily has a very different culture than Naples. Naples has a very different culture than Venice, and so on. You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
rather than focusing on a country, you can go more specific than that. The more specific the culture, the more in-depth you can get, and the more interesting content you can pull out.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah, I got it.
These are very good questions because these are things that you really want to watch out for when selecting your topic. Now,
Okay.
Lou, you had a question about the informative speech. Did I answer the questions or you still have some more?
It's gonna be a lot of work to do. I'm looking forward to it.
Hey, that's the attitude, right? That's the spirit. Yeah. So just moving on. Now, like I said, this speech will be 3 to 5 minutes long. You'll be writing an outline for this speech as well. This outline is due next Sunday. That is the
21st?
No, that is the
20th.
YouTube people. Don't I look so
the
professional?
12th.
July 12th.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 12th.
So it's due on the 12th. So you want to start brainstorming topics as soon as possible. You want to have a topic by at least the next time we meet for Zoom by Wednesday, because the sooner you have a topic, the sooner you can email me about it, you can ask me about it, you can say, does this topic work? What do you think I can do for this topic? And so on. You want to give yourself more time so you can play around with it before actually writing anything down. Just like before, this speech will be recorded and submitted using GoReact on Canvas. Here are just some learning outcomes for this specific speech. Here's a little bit more of a general requirement.
Yes, I read them all this morning.
There you go, Lou, getting the leg up. So, you want to pick a culture that genuinely interests you. Think about a culture that you might not be a part of, but that you've always wanted to learn a little bit more about. Skydiving culture, for instance. Underwater basket weaving culture, for instance. Sicilian culture. Try to think of a culture that has always kind of caught your eye, but that you've never really been able to immerse yourself in. Because the more passionate you are about learning about this culture, the easier it's going to be to actually deliver this speech. Because if you just pick a topic that you think is easy or that you think will be easy to adapt into an outline, then it's going to feel like dragging your feet the whole while. It's going to be very difficult to actually do proper research on that. once you have your topic, you're then going to want to break it up into 3 distinct parts of that culture that you want to talk about. So those 3 distinct parts are effectively the body of your speech. Remember, you can't cover an entire culture in that period of time, but you could pick any 3 aspects of that culture that you think are most interesting to the audience. So you can pick the history of the culture, you can pick the food of the culture, you can pick a major event in that culture's history, you can pick a specific trend or custom, such as the running of the bulls in Pamplona, Spain, and so on. And then, because this is a research-based assignment, what you're required to do is you are then required to formally cite sources of research in your speech outline and your speech. Just to gauge a little bit your prior experience with that, has anyone here ever used MLA format in any written assignments at Miramar or anywhere else?
Yes,
Yeah.
I used that for my English class for semester. We are required to use only MLA, not AP.
Well, Lou, I'm sorry to say, but we are required to use APA in this class. So you're familiar with how citation works. You're familiar with that if you get knowledge from anywhere that's not your own, you have to formally cite it using a structured system. However, in this class, we can't use MLA. We have to use APA format. Later today, I'm going to teach you about APA format. Again, it's just like learning a new set of rules for MLA, but the basic principles are all the same. But you're required to cite and research a minimum of 6 different sources of knowledge in your outline, and then 3 of those sources during your speech. Later today, I'm going to give you examples of what that actually looks like when citing and sourcing information, as well as how to actually cite it when giving your speech in person. And I'd like to cover the format of your informative speech, because it's very similar in a lot of ways to the speech of introduction outline. There's going to be a couple of added elements. So just like before, you want to try and grab the audience's attention. You want to try to immediately hook them with your most interesting fact. You can try to tell a story about the culture. You can try to tell an interesting statistic about the culture. You can try to do whatever you can to make the audience wake up and listen to a culture that they're not necessarily a part of. Then you're providing a reason to listen. Now, the reason to listen is essentially answering the question, why should I care? Let's say, for example, that I wanted to give a speech on the running of the bulls in Spain. But, and I'm just picking a name out of the hat, Rodrigo does not live in Spain. He might not ever go to the running of the bulls. So why should he pay attention and learn about this culture that he'll never be a part of? What's his reason to listen? Now, how you answer this question is you demonstrate how important this culture is. You can demonstrate how important this culture is by mentioning how big it is, how old it is, how much of an effect it's had on the world, how it might influence our lives today, and so on. So I'm going to give a couple of example topics, and then I'm going to provide reasons to listen of why we might want to learn that. Now, a good example I like to give is anyone here familiar with brony culture? It's not as big now, but it was really big 5-6 years ago.
Is that the My Little Pony thing?
Exactly. So the people who aren't familiar, brony culture is a dedicated fan group of adult men who are very big fans of a cartoon show called My Little Pony: Friendship is Magic. Now this show is aimed at young girls, but it has a dedicated following of adult men aged 20 to 40. Now, you might think, okay, bronies, well, how many can there possibly be? 12, 20, a couple hundred, that kind of thing. But what might shock you is that at its height, Brony culture consisted of over 2 million people around the world. 2 million people were part of Brony culture. That's larger than the population of San Diego. So that's a huge following, and that's something we might normally not pay a lot of attention to. But just by mentioning its size, it has you go, okay, wow, I didn't know that before. And if it's so big, then what do all these people see in common about it? And so on. So by mentioning its size, you provide a reason to listen. By mentioning its history, you can also provide a reason to listen. Let's say I wanted to give a speech on the culture of the Roman Empire. Now, what I can do is I can say, well, if you might not know this, but the Roman Empire lasted almost half a millennium. It's the single longest continuous civilization, that one of the longest continuous civilizations. That means that it's lasted the longest among all other civilizations, and that it's had a huge impact on just our daily life, because the government of the United States of America was in a lot of ways modeled on the government of the early Roman Republic. That means that a lot of our language, a lot of our laws, a lot of the way our very society is structured is modeled on this culture that's almost 2,000 years old at this point. So that's providing another reason to listen by demonstrating the impact that culture has had in the world today or among other different cultures. So once you provided a reason to listen, those are just some examples of how you do that, you then establish your credibility as a speaker, because you want the audience to actually listen to you. But that means that the audience has to first know that you are absolutely credible on this subject, that you know what you're talking about. Because if you're just listening to someone talk about anything that you're not familiar with, then you might go, okay, why do you know more than me? Why can't I just learn more through a simple Google search? What can you teach me that I don't already know? You want to establish your credibility because you always want to sound like you know a lot about the subject, enough so that when I say something, you immediately can take it as fact. Well, not take it as objective fact, but that you know that there's something to be said. I need to establish my credibility as an instructor, because if you don't think I know my stuff, if you don't think I can teach you about public speaking, then you're so much less likely to actually do the assignments, tune into the lectures, watch the lectures after, because you won't think that I'm actually a credible source of knowledge. You can actually learn something from me. Now, how you establish that credibility is through your research. You are not a member of this culture, so you can't really tell us that you have an extensive experience with it. But what you can do is you can mention people who do have that extensive experience. What you do in your speaker credibility is you mention specific sources of research from where you're getting some of the knowledge you're going to be using in this speech. An example of establishing your speaker credibility is saying something like, drawing from sources such as Harvard University and the Washington Post, I'm here today to talk about the running of the bulls that occurs every year in Pamplona, Spain. Now, I don't know a lot about the running of the bulls. I've never actually been to it, but I'm now citing experts who have. So now the audience will think, okay, maybe this person doesn't intimately know everything firsthand, but they're getting their knowledge from people who do. So by using the credibility of your sources, you now establish your credibility to the audience. And then lastly, well, not lastly, and then you're providing a thesis statement. The thesis statement you can keep relatively basic. Before I'd be like, you need a theme for your thesis statement, but let's keep it relatively simple just because you don't have a lot of time to work through it. But for your thesis statement, you're just telling us what culture you will be talking about today. Simple as that. Thesis statement, what culture are you talking about today? And then when you preview your main points, just mention what are the 3 to 5, remember, minimum of 3, maximum of 5, distinct things you're going to be talking about this culture. An example of a preview main points could be saying something like, so today I'll be talking about Italian food, Italian architecture, and Italian history to try to give you an idea of the to try to give you an idea of what Italian culture is really like. And that's an example of repeating main points. And then, in each of these main points, you're just going to be talking about one of the distinct aspects of this culture. This allows you to get more specific. Now, I'm going to give a lecture on chapter 5 where we talk about how we actually use our supporting evidence, but I say that so much, but remember, just like with your speech of introduction, you want to be as specific as possible. You don't want to be vague here. A culture is not some abstract blob. A culture is not just this separate thing. A culture is composed of people and individuals. It's composed of individuals living their lives just like anybody else. So, you want to provide specific examples. Tell us about some of the specific members of a culture. Tell us about what actually living a day in the life of people within that culture actually looks like. That was an incredibly awkward sentence. Give us specific examples of personal accounts, of specific individuals, of specific events, of specific locations, and so on. The more specific you are, the more you're able to present a culture through the eyes of the people within it, the more an audience can actually learn about what it's like to be a part of that culture. Because you can't really describe a culture as a series of attributes and preferences and likes. You have to describe it as people engaging with one another to create an organized community. So, and then lastly, for your conclusion, you're just reviewing it all for the audience, so you're absolutely sure that they know what you talked about today. Remember that the goal is that you want them to actually try to remember this knowledge after walking out and after being done listening to your speech. So you're restating your thesis. What culture did we talk about today? You're reviewing your main points. What were the distinct aspects of your speech? And you're ending on a memorable closing line that actually has the audience able to recall what you just talked about. Okay? You're ending with a flourish, with emphasis, with style. So, does anyone have any questions on the informative speech? Any questions at all?
Not at the moment.
Okay. So, like I said, you want to start reviewing some topics. You want to start thinking about what you'd actually like to give a speech on. And then feel free to send me an email and go, hey, I'm thinking of talking about this. Do you think this would work? What do you think would work for main points? What do you think would work for a good thesis statement? And so on. And the sooner you can do that, the more time we have to work together and try to get your speech into its best possible shape. Now we're going to transition to the lecture on chapter 5, using supporting materials effectively. All right, just going to take a sip, and the bottle's empty. Cool. Okay, so I emphasize this is a research assignment. This is where you're getting knowledge from external sources, and then you're using them, you're citing them in your actual speech. What this chapter is focused on is it is teaching you how to actually use that supporting evidence effectively, how to use that external knowledge in a way that has the greatest possible impact on the audience. Because anyone can just copy paste a quote from a Times Magazine article. Anyone can hit Control-C, Control-V, and then just slap it in their outline and, okay, 1 down, 5 to go. But would just copy-pasting a line really have the audience listen to you? Remember that you're not just doing this because I have some weird fixation on teaching you APA, that I just can't sleep at night knowing that you were somehow got away with not doing online research. I'm doing this because supporting evidence is a tool to enhance your speeches, to actually give weight to your words. We're going to talk about how to add the most weight, and at this point, I'm kind of mixing the metaphor there. But we're going to skip the warm-up question for today. I think we've skipped almost every warm-up question. But let me ask you this. Why do you think your speech needs supporting materials? I kind of answered that question about 30 seconds ago, but why do you think you need supporting materials for this speech and for your persuasive speech?
To establish credibility.
Exactly. We're establishing our credibility because if the audience doesn't think this is coming from a reputable source, from someone who actually did the legwork and did the research, then they're not actually going to feel like they need to learn this or that it's worth learning about. We're going to cover 2 to 4, I forgot the exact count, of types of supporting materials, starting with the example. When I talked about your speech outline, I mentioned that you want to use specific examples in your speech. We're going to talk about 2 general types and 2 general ways of delivering an example. The first, of course, is the hypothetical example. The hypothetical example is something that didn't actually happen. You're inventing an imaginary situation that helps the listeners visualize themselves in a situation they've never been in before. The hypothetical doesn't mean that it had to have happened, but it's there so that the audience can actually begin seeing something, put a visual frame of reference to the words you're putting out there. Because it can be very dry to describe something. Because remember, I've said because, remember, and but about 8,000 times just this lecture. We talked about last week how you need to be vivid in your description, how you need to have the audience see beyond just the literal things that are happening. You want to have the audience feel like they're actually there. A hypothetical example helps put them there. So an example of a hypothetical example would be saying something along the lines of, you wake up, you instantly hear the call of a seagull outside your window. The very ground itself seeming to ebb and flow beneath your feet, as if you were on one long continuous boat. It's the smell of salt water mixed with fresh water, cries shouting across narrow streets as buildings themselves dip and ebb in the horizon. This is a Venetian morning, and within the city of Venice, it might seem a bit odd to you, but it's just everyday life for the people that live within it. I could just say, Venice floats on top of water, but that doesn't actually describe the experience of what it's like. I've never been to Venice, but I can try to put my audience as if they were there, as if they can actually visualize it. So it has a very large persuasive impact because now the audience can put themselves in that situation, so they're much more likely to get invested in that situation. Contrast that with the real example. The real example actually happened. The real example, because it's a true story, carries immediacy and impact with the audience. Now there's actually weight to what you're talking about, because this isn't just making up a story to them. This is something that's real and that's here and now and real and affecting the lives of so many different people. The real example helps hammer in what it would actually be like to live inside of that culture. Because now you're not just making up you're not just making up a story. Now you're telling us the experience of an actual person and what their life is like in the day-to-day. You can try telling me a hypothetical, but at the end of the day, I'm going to go, okay, but you're not part of that culture. I don't really know if that can actually happen. I don't know if that's what it's really like. But by consulting a member of that culture, by getting their firsthand testimony, now I know, okay, wow, everything you're saying is accurate. It is kind of like living like that, and so on. One person can't tell the entire culture. I live in the United States, but I don't represent the entire American culture. But it goes a long way towards helping establish that credibility. 2 ways of delivering that example are through a brief example and an extended example. The brief example lists things as a listing. The brief example has many examples presented as a list there to try to keep the audience's attention and demonstrate the scope of something, how big something is. An example of a brief example, or a brief example, would be saying something along the lines of, okay, so you're all currently enrolled at Miramar College. That's really cool. Again, great school, a lot of great options. Well, if you're interested in taking classes outside of Miramar, then San Diego State has a wide range of community colleges to pick from. Because you can obviously go to within the district, and you can go to Mesa College and City College. But if you want to look a little bit beyond that, you can go to Miracosta College. You can try checking out Cuyamaca College. You can try checking out Grossmont, Palomar, and Southwestern University. Now, I'm not explaining each of those colleges in depth. I'm not giving you an in-depth explanation of what Grossmont classes are like versus what Palomar classes are like. But by listing them all, now it goes beyond just saying, okay, there's a lot of options to pick from. By listing how many there are, now it's much more obvious to you, and now the words have a specific frame of reference that you can return to. As for the extended example uses the power of stories to engage and maintain the audience's attention. By telling an extended story, by referring to specific events, people, places, it's so much easier for the audience to follow along. That's why you don't just want to tell about your cultures in the abstract. Try to tell stories related to those cultures. Try to tell stories with specific characters, with specific events, the things they do, who they interact with, and so on. By telling it as a more grounded personal story, the audience is now able to directly empathize, emotionally connect to a culture, rather than just learning about it as something dry and distant from them. Some guidelines for using examples effectively in your speech are: first, be relevant. Actually connect your example to the rest of your speech. The audience needs to understand why this example is important and what valuable lesson they could actually learn from it. So you want to connect your example back to your main point. You want to connect your main point back to your thesis. You want to connect your thesis back to your theme. In doing so, you make your entire speech sound well-rounded and like everything is there for a specific purpose. Next, like I talked about earlier, you want to be vivid. You want to try to work to create an image, something they can actually visualize in the audience's mind. Go beyond just describing the surface level of something. Try to use sensory detail. Pull me into the specific time and moment. Try to describe what something sounds like. Try to describe what something smells like, what something feels like, the texture of something, the taste of something. Don't just tell me what food this culture likes to eat. Tell me what it tastes like. Tell me what it's like to make. Try to describe it. Give me a hankering for it, and so on. I just used the word hankering, and that sounds very weird, but oh well. Next, you want to be representative. A culture cannot be described by any one person. Just because you talk to one person or you heard the testimony of one person of that culture does not mean that you've heard everything there is to know about their culture. Every culture is different from a variety of different perspectives and viewpoints. For example, I'm a part of American culture, but I experience American culture from the perspective of a man. That's a very different perspective from the perspective of American culture for people who don't identify as strictly male, and so on. So if you talk to me about American culture, just by my limited perspective alone, I'm not able to describe every element of American culture. I'm not even able to describe every element of San Diegan culture. So you want to try to go beyond that single story. You want to try and present the testimonies of as many different perspectives as possible. The more people you can include in your speech, the more well-rounded a perspective you can provide on that specific culture. And that ties in to the last guideline, which is to be thorough. You want to provide multiple examples throughout your speech. They all provide an added effect. They all help make your culture seem much more real and relatable to the audience. The more examples you use, the more you bring your culture to life as people living together, united by something in common, rather than an abstract, nebulous thing that I don't really know how to put my finger on. Now, I'm just going to rush right into some guidelines for using statistics effectively. You're using examples, but you also want to use statistics in your informative and persuasive speeches. A statistic is just any numerical representation of anything. A statistic is anything that can be represented by a number. This can be a number, a percentage, a probability, odds, whatever. A statistic can be something along the lines of 74% of this Comms 103 class does not attend the Zoom meeting. That's just a statistic, right? A numerical representation. But just throwing a statistic in isn't enough to actually get the audience to care about it. I can tell you that 70% of 62% of 40% of 50% of the people listening to this sentence will have lost me by now. But you need to try and present a statistic using these guidelines in order to actually make the statistic appear significant to the audience, so that the audience actually learns something from it. First, obviously, you want to be accurate with the statistic. You want to portray the statistic in its most direct, obvious way so you don't mislead the audience and teach them something purposefully wrong. An example of this would be saying something along the lines of, hey, here's a fun fact. Did you know, and I will 100% stand by this, this is absolutely true, did you know that you can live the rest of your life underwater? What's wrong with that statistic?
There's no numbers.
Okay. Did you know that 100% of people can live the rest of their lives completely underwater?
It's a lie.
How so?
Well, we can prove it.
Oh, it's not a lie, Rodrigo. Again, 100% true. No lie, no sarcasm. Every single person, even in this Zoom call, can live the rest of their life underwater. You don't even need to bring an oxygen.
Oh my God.
What's wrong with that fact? What's wrong?
I'm not citing sources or of that or...
You're close. Well, it's because you can live the rest of your life underwater, but if you dive underwater, the rest of your life is probably going to be an average of 2 to 3 minutes long.
Right.
So that's how it misleads the audience, because it has them thinking something, even technically what I'm saying is true, but I'm leaving out a critical piece of information of you can live the rest of your life underwater, it's just going to be a very short rest of your life. Next, you want to be meaningful in that statistic. You want to try to present it in a way that actually has the audience pay attention and go, wow, that is a big number. Because I can say something along the lines of, many teachers quit very early in their careers. People will go, okay, many, so probably like 1 in 10, right? Or, yeah, I remember hearing my teacher from the elementary school, they quit, that kind of thing. Or I can present it as 50% of all teachers will quit their job in the first 5 years. 1 in 2 teachers will stop teaching within the first 5 years of beginning their career. It's one of the highest dropout rates of any job in the United States. That immediately is meaningful to the audience because now 50% is a huge number. Half of all teachers will stop teaching. And first 5 years, that's pretty early in a lot of careers. A lot of us have been working for that long or longer in a specific job. 5 years doesn't sound like that long. So by presenting it that way, it now sounds so much more impactful to an audience. You can also use comparisons. You can try to compare different concepts so that the audience now has a much more specific frame of reference for what you're talking about. An example would be saying something along the lines of, every year we waste an average of 9 billion tons of food. That sounds like a lot, sounds like a big number, but no one really knows what 9 billion actually is. Our brains literally haven't evolved to conceptualize that number. Because if I say 10, you can think of 10 of something. You can think of 10 apples. When I tell you to think of 9 billion of something, your mind just kind of shorts out and just kind of think of a really long number. How I can present that is I could go, every year we waste the equivalent of 13 Empire State Buildings of food. That means that we waste 13 Empire State Buildings in food every year. now you can think of how big the Empire State Building is. Imagine Empire State Building made entirely of food. Now imagine 13 of those, and then imagine all of that going to waste instead of going to people who desperately need it. That provides a much more specific frame of reference. Now you're actually able to visualize how big a number that really is. And full disclosure, that number is probably completely way off, but that's just an example of how you can reframe your statistic so the audience actually knows what you're talking about. And lastly, be credible with your statistic. Mention directly where it came from so that now the audience knows, okay, I didn't just pull this number out of my butt, but someone who has a lot of experience in the field who knows what they're talking about pulled up this very credible statistic. We've probably heard this a lot lately. According to the CDC, the Central for Disease Control. That's an immediately credible source. We know they know what they're talking about. As opposed to saying something like, according to mommyblogs.net, vaccines are very likely to cause autism. Yes, that's a source, but does mommyblogs.net really sound like someone who has extensive experience in the fields of virology, in disease, in autism, and so on? Not really, right? And now, how to actually cite this information during your speech is used through what's called verbal footnotes. Verbal footnotes are where you quote the specific source during your speech. So, or not quote, paraphrase, sorry. I'll talk a little bit about this in 5 minutes when I talk about APA, but what you want to do is that when you take knowledge from someone else, you don't want to quote it directly, quote it word for word. Instead, what you want to do is you want to paraphrase. Paraphrasing is when you take an expert's words, rephrase them back in your own words, while still saying this came from that other source. That might sound confusing, but an example would be, so, let's say, no, that's even worse. Let's say that I wanted to cite this specific quote. Let's say that I wanted to quote this specific paragraph. I could say, the typical student does not have a rigid internal moral compass or academic drive, but instead addresses academic assignments as situations on a chessboard in which costs and benefits are calculated and compared to peer norms in order to ascertain what goal seems most reasonable in that particular case, according to Johnson. I didn't need to say all that, though. I didn't need to say it word for word, because the audience is very bored by me reading it. You were probably bored by me reading it right now. And it didn't matter that I said it word for word. So what I can do is I can take that passage, that paragraph, understand, okay, what's the most important element of this paragraph? What does it really say? And then rephrase it in my own words, as if I were explaining what it was about to the audience. So I can take this paragraph, and instead of saying it word for word, I can instead just say, according to Johnson, students plagiarize if they feel it's the easiest way to complete an assignment. Both are saying the exact same thing. Both are making the exact same point. The second one, however, sounds a lot more natural for me to say. It's a lot easier for the audience to follow along, and it's a lot easier to incorporate into the rest of my speech. So, I can't repeat this enough. Do not directly quote sources word for word. Don't just copy paste. Try to put that information in your own words. Try to paraphrase as much as possible. By doing so, it's a lot easier to actually convey this information to your audience. Even when paraphrasing, though, even when putting something in your own words, you still want to cite the original author. You still want to say where you're getting the information from. Because you didn't learn this, because this isn't your knowledge. You didn't do this research. It's not your original content. You're still getting this from someone else. You might not be using their exact words, but you're still using their ideas. You don't say where it comes from. That still qualifies as plagiarism. So does anyone have any questions on quoting versus paraphrasing? Okay, so in your informative speech, you need to cite at least 3 of your sources while giving it. That means at least 3 different times during your speech, you want to say something like, according to Johnson, students feel they plagiarize if they feel it's the easiest way to complete an assignment. You want to at least 3 different times mention a source of research that you're drawing this knowledge from. Now I'm going to talk about APA. APA is very technical, just like MLA. It's very rule-oriented. I absolutely recommend that you have this PowerPoint open while you're writing your informative speech outline. It'll help you save on a lot of mistakes, on a lot of common errors, and it'll help you avoid plagiarizing. Fun fact, 90% of all plagiarism, of every instance of someone copying someone else's work, is unintentional. They didn't mean to do it. They just accidentally put someone else's knowledge but forgot to say where it was from. Most plagiarism is a mistake. The way you avoid that mistake is you try to get as familiar as possible with APA and always double check your sources and citations. So like I said, you have to quote or paraphrase at least 3 different sources in the text of your outline. To cite a source at the beginning or the end of the citation, simply list the last name of the author followed by the year of publication. So if I wanted to say plagiarism is bad, which I drew from a source written by Johnson, in parentheses I put last name Johnson, comma, year of publication. This means that according to an article by Johnson published in the year 2012, he said that plagiarism is bad. You can also say according to Johnson and then not have to put this in parentheses. Just put the year in parentheses. Plagiarism is bad. Does that make sense to everybody? Again, if you have any questions, go ahead and raise your hand.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, right? Directly quoting something can be a lazy shortcut. Don't just copy paste, because it's going to make your speech sound very unnatural. It's going to sound very much like you just constantly switching between your natural speaking style and something that's totally not your own words. It also puts a huge pressure on yourself when delivering this speech, because now you have to memorize these quotes word for word. So you always want to try paraphrasing instead. You always want to try putting something back in your own words, in your own content. And then for each time that you cite something in the text of your outline, on a separate page, you want to make a reference for each of those citations. So how citations work, how references work, again, that might sound confusing, but you're citing something and you're making a reference for it. This reference is essentially a shorthand to tell people where to find the source of the knowledge you're drawing from. The format for citing an academic article is as follows. You put the last name of the author, then the first and middle initial. You then put as many different authors as are listed, separated by commas and ampersands. That's what that symbol is. You then put the year of publication in parentheses, and this one's tricky. You then put the title of the article, but only capitalize the first word of that title, okay? It's not like English class. You only capitalize the first word of that title. Everything else is lowercase, okay? You don't capitalize like a regular title. And this is confusing because then for the journal title, you properly capitalize it as if it's a book and then italicize it. That's how you get that slanted font. You then italicize the journal number. You then list the pages that the article appears on, and you can provide the DOI, but I'm not requiring it, so don't necessarily worry about this. This is how you cite an academic article. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to show you a resource you can use for getting some academic articles. Now, If there's two or more authors of a text, you just put an ampersand to unite the two authors. Instead of parentheses, you put Johnson Romero 2011. If there's three or more authors, you put, instead of listing all the authors, you put after the third author, you put et al. That's Latin for and so on, just so you don't have to list 8 different authors in parentheses. Just remember that if you cite a source, you have to list it as a reference. If you cite a source, it has to have a reference. And conversely, if you put something as a reference on a separate page of your outline, you have to have cited it at least once in the text of your outline, okay? For your informative speech outline, you need a minimum of 6 sources cited and referenced. 6 sources cited and referenced. To reiterate, if you're using the exact words, you are quoting. If you interpret the statement in your own words, you are paraphrasing. You want to be paraphrasing, not quoting. The specific format for a reference changes based on the type of source. That means that you follow a different reference format if you're citing a book than, say, if you were citing a magazine article. How you would cite a book is you put the last name of the author, the first and middle initial, you put the year of publication, you put the title of the book, only capitalizing the first letter of the book, and then you put the location of the publisher and the name of the publisher, okay? So what this means is that I'm citing a book called Interpersonal Communication Competence, which was written by Brian Spitzberg and William Kapak. It was published in 1984 in the city of Beverly Hills by the Sage Publishing Company, okay? If you want to cite a news or magazine article or an online article, you put the last name of the author, first and middle initial, you put the year, the month, and the day of publication, you put the title of the article, again, only capitalize the first letter, you properly capitalize the title of the publication that the article is actually published in, and if it's an online article, you put retrieve from followed by the link to the article, okay? What this basically means is that I'm citing an article called Psychiatry Handbook Linked to Drug Industry, which was published in the May edition of the New York Times in the year 2008, written by Tim Parker Pope, okay? Here is the link to that article. Here's just a short list of the different types of sources and how you would reference each of those types of sources, okay? There's everything from books to YouTube videos. I'd highly recommend you having this open while you're writing your speech outline. For additional resources, you can go to Purdue OWL, which is basically an online resource that no longer has a valid web link. Egg on my face, okay? All right, well, here's a link to Purdue OWL. Basically, it has everything you might need if you have any questions on APA in the Cite tab. So you just click APA Formatting and Style Guide. It's going to show you all the basics of in-text citation. It's going to show you the basics of making a reference. It's going to show you the basics of referencing books. It's going to show you the basics of other types of sources. It's going to show you how to source it's going to show you how to reference an electronic source, and so on. It's a really great resource to have. And I'm going to show you another tool, Google Scholar, okay? So, another great tool to have is Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a great resource for academic articles. These are basically articles that were published by universities and by academic professors for the sole purpose of learning more about a specific field. I'm going to tell you why it's a great source of research and why it's going to help a lot with your citation. Someone give me a topic, a culture. Let's take Italian. culture, okay? So, for Italian culture, let's say that I wanted to cite this specific article, the interaction between culture, health, and psychological well-being. Well, the reason why Google Scholar is a great resource for this is because, and follow along with this, if you click this little quotation mark button, and it's going to pull up the full citation of the source. Now you can just copy and paste it into your reference list. Isn't that useful? But then you might be asking, okay, well, Mr. Johnson, why the hell did you give a lecture on it? Why didn't you just show us this? It's because the problem with using this is that it's almost always going to have at least one key mistake. So don't just copy paste it. Don't just copy and forget it. Always double check to make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. That the article title is properly capitalized. That the last name of the author has the first and middle initial. That there's a year of publication. That there's proper page numbers. This reference is perfectly fine. This reference is 100% correct. But you'll find that in most of them, at least 2/3 of them, you're going to find at least one critical mistake. Because, so say for example that I wanted to cite this book. This book has no location of publisher. This book is properly capitalized, but it has no actual name of the publisher or location of the publisher. I don't know if Springer is the location or the actual name of the company that published the book. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to do horticulture. Okay, so if I want to cite this article, this reference is correct, but this reference is not. Because, actually this reference is correct too. Never mind, but my point stands, even though I might have already defeated it. You always want to pay close attention, because the number of times that I submitted a reference page that I got from Google Scholar that they got marked down significantly, that I lost a ton of grade points on, it's almost every time I actually did it. Turns referencing into a game of Where's Waldo? Can you spot the error? And so on, okay? So, that pretty much wraps up my lecture on APA. Does anyone have any questions for me on APA, on Chapter 5, on the informative speech, anything we talked about today?
No.
Okay. Well, if we've got no other questions, all I can really recommend is, again, we're done for the day. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for stopping by. Please look over the handouts as soon as possible. Start picking a topic. Start workshopping it. Feel free to ask me of what works about a topic, what we can do differently about a topic. Try to avoid overused topics. Try to avoid just talking about Italian culture. And if you have any questions, feel free to stop at my office hours or send me an email. Okay? So, again, thank you all for stopping by. I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day, and hope to see you all again on Wednesday. Bye, y'all.